Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 180 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 300 partners from all over the world that have come together during this pandemic to provide a daily open space for people worldwide to come together to share their experiences, their concerns, to discuss a range of issues pertaining to the human future with the intent that under these very challenging circumstances, humanity will indeed rise and shape a better world. We all know that's possible. The question is, how do we create a critical mass sufficient to fulfill that aspiration? We like to start each of our sessions with a minute or two of heart coherence. There's a raging sea of chaos all around, and one of the most effective and heartful ways of creating coherence is just pausing, taking a few deep breaths, and closing our eyes, and see if you can just put your attention on your heart. Try to listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we are all alive together at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who have joined this session, I would like to commence our program with the following observations, and then we will bring on our panelists. Today, the U.S. Senate begins the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. He's being charged with inciting insurrection against the people, government, and Constitution of the United States, coming out of his comportment around the 2020 presidential election, which was the largest and by all accounts, one of the most transparent and fair elections in US history. And he considered it and spoke vehemently about it as a fraud and incited his ultra right-wing followers, white supremacists, the Proud Boys, arch militants of all kinds, on January 6th to storm the Capitol building with an intent to assassinate high government officials, including the Vice President, Mike Pence, and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. The attempt failed, but I would say the structures and the foundation of the United States were shaken. They weren't destroyed, but it was the first explicit attempted coup in our nation's history, transacted not by the military, but by the president while he was still in the Oval Office. What they call in political science a self-coup, where someone is legitimately elected, as Trump was, but then refuses to give up and manipulates either the voting or the aftermath, is normally the case, as Trump did, to try to engineer some kind of manipulation that will enable him to seize power and continue in office. There were some accounts that have surfaced in the news just yesterday that remember General Flynn, who was caught lying at the early days of the Trump administration in early 2017, lied to the FBI, lied to the Justice Department about his contacts with the Russians, and then also some intrigue in which he was engaged with the Turkish government. He was pardoned by Trump over the last number of months, and he was calling for a declaration of martial law. And Trump was considering having Flynn appointed as the director of the FBI. So whether it was through the post office, through maneuverings in the Pentagon, replacing the Secretary of Defense the day after the election, appointing 4 or 5 of his henchmen to high office in the Department of Defense, and then, of course, through Twitter until he was shut down, fomenting active incitement to insurrection. That's all starting today, later on today in the US Senate. At the heart of the Trump presidency is a very, I would say, peculiar relationship that Donald Trump had with the Russian government and the Russian intelligence community. And that was at the heart of the controversy around the 2016 election. If you remember that, there was all kinds of evidence that the Trump campaign and the Russian government, through a series of intermediaries, was in collusion around manipulating social media, around hacking voting machines, around disrupting the democratic process in the United States, stealing emails from the Democratic Party, stealing emails specifically from Hillary Clinton, and then, as you all remember, releasing those emails to the public, timed to have maximum effect on the election. Recently, in The Guardian magazine, a former intelligence officer of the Russian government said that they had marked out Trump as early as the 1970s, when he married Ivanka Trump, his first wife, who was Eastern European. And they saw him as a very wealthy, brash, easily manipulated, essential asset according to this official, and they began to um, cultivate him. And if you know your espionage, there are 4 ways, and it's the acronym MICE. Money is often a way that they manipulate an asset. Ideology is a way that they manipulate an asset. Some kind of moral compromise is another way of manipulating an asset. And then the 4th one, which fit Trump to a T, was ego. So typically people are turned against their own country through money, through ideology, through compromise, and through ego. And that is how they began to cultivate Trump as far back as the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, continued the cultivation, according to this intelligence officer, that led to encouraging him to run for the presidency, making available to him all kinds of policy positions that would benefit the Russian government and strategic interests. And I think we all saw during the 4 years of the Trump presidency a rather, again, peculiar relationship with the Russian government. And that raised in all of our minds who Vladimir Putin is and how we in the West should consider him and how we should evaluate him, because the general relationship between the Soviet Union during most of the 20th century and now Russia with the West generally, and the United States in particular, has always been fraught and unstable and given to ebbs and flows, both on the Russian side and on the Western and American side. So today we wanted to hear from Vladimir Posner. He is somehow not available. We haven't been able to access him on Zoom or by email or by phone. We're not sure what's happening on his end. So I apologize that Vladimir is not able to join us. He may have had a blackout of his internet. And so today I want to welcome Cynthia Lazaroff, who you all know. She's been on the program 3 or 4 times now, really guiding and developing our sessions on, remember, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then on January 22nd of this year on the UN passage of the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Also want to welcome Jim Hickman, who, like Cynthia, has been working with Russians. Jim's been working with the Russians in one way or another since the 1970s. Cynthia from the 1980s. So we have, and we're had them planned on the program to join Vladimir so that we could have their comments, because Vladimir has a very compelling narrative of how the United States, in fact, and the NATO alliance have over the decades actually shaped what Vladimir Putin has become. And let's see, I'll consult with the two of you. Why don't we just have you comment on your perceptions of the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and anything you want to share about what you know about Vladimir Putin. Maybe by then, Mr. Posner will have joined us. And if not, then we can go in and I can summarize easily Vladimir Posner's perspective on Vladimir Putin. But Cynthia, why don't we start with you? I'd love to have your comment on these things, and then Jim, and then we'll move into our program.
Thank you, Jim. It's really, again, an honor and a privilege and a joy to be here with you all. And I have texted Vladimir. I was able to get through on text, so I'm hoping that he'll be able to join us. We'll see what's happening. You know, having re-engaged fully in this US-Russia relations over the last 4 years, after taking a break and doing environmental work, after all the work we did in the citizen diplomacy in the 1980s, it's been a really interesting journey coming back into this. And I think that clearly there's a very complicated history that you've addressed between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And in the conversations that I'm having with Russians and have had over the past 4 years, as the relationship had already deteriorated and as it was deteriorating further, we talked about trying to see things through each other's eyes and what it really looks like on each side. And having not been able to go to Russia now since COVID, I haven't been able to be having the in-person quiet around the dinner table conversations that are so important in this relationship. But I will say this, you know, and the perspective that Vladimir brings to this, I would say that Vladimir Putin is a very complicated figure. And I think some things that just to understand where he's coming from, putting ourselves into the shoes of the Russian side, you know, he, like everyone in the Soviet Union, every family was impacted by World War II deeply. They lost 27 million people. He lost a brother during the war. So that shaped his perspective growing up. And he, like Gorbachev and Vladimir, speaks about this so eloquently. He has a lecture that he did at Yale that I would encourage everyone to take a look at on YouTube, called How the United States Created Vladimir Putin. At the end of the Cold War, there was a moment where there was an opportunity for our two countries to realize a different kind of relationship and to come together. And that was really what the vision was that Gorbachev espoused. And when Gorbachev met with James Baker to talk about the reunification of Germany, there was a moment where he said that he would allow it to happen. He wouldn't oppose it if NATO did not expand 1 inch to the east. And there was this verbal agreement that happened. And that was a trusted agreement. It was never written down. And that was true for a while after the Berlin Wall came down and after the Cold War ended. But then under Clinton, there was a decision in 1996 to expand NATO, which felt like a very big betrayal to the Russians. And it was a betrayal for Gorbachev, for all Russians. They felt like they had lost their trust, they had lost their hope for a friend they were going to be cooperating with, and the relationship began to deteriorate from there. I'll just say also about Vladimir Putin, he was the first, not to say that I'm a Putin supporter or a Putin fan in any sense. He's an authoritarian leader. Democracy has suffered, but he was the first, just to remember that he was the first, after he came to power, he was the first leader after 9/11 to call George Bush and offer bases in Afghanistan to help us try to get Al-Qaeda. So he had this hope that he could still somehow work out a partnership with the United States, and that Russia was treated as, you're not important anymore. You lost the Cold War. So, and from their perspective, we agreed to end the Cold War. They didn't lose it. It was, we all won the Cold War because we didn't blow each other up, right? So there was this sense of the continuing expansion of NATO that, to simplify what Vladimir goes into great detail on, that by a meeting in Munich of the G20 in 2007, Putin basically said, look, enough is enough. Russia is going to now come back and challenge the West. And there's still a deep sense of betrayal, bitterness, not being taken seriously. They still have 90%, together we have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So there's been this drive from their perspective to be heard, to have a seat at the table, to not have NATO continue to expand to their borders. I think that's the mindset that has created the man that Putin has become today, and what's been going on in relations from their side. So I'm just stepping into their shoes for a second. We know what the Western side is, but that's the way, to put it very simply, I've simplified it, the way they see the world and the way they see the relationship. And so that's sort of the background that I would state on Putin. And I think that there is, again, with what we know has been a very, very destructive on both sides deterioration of the relationship, and clearly interference by Russia in our elections, and as you have mentioned, some kind of influence on Donald Trump to a profound extent. There has been all of that. We're at a time where there's also been a very, very deep demonization that's been going on of Russia and Putin, that is destructive to the good of the whole. So I think that the question we need to be asking ourselves right now is one that we touched on in the last session that we all did together. That Jim, you raised, Jim Hickman. Something wants to happen here. What is our inner guidance telling us that wants to happen now? How do we move forward? How do we change the story? How do we write a new story? How do we reimagine the relationship at a time when, we have the existential nuclear threat, we've got climate, we've got the pandemic. How can we turn this around like we did back in the 1980s? That's the question that I would pose for us to really consider together.
Thank you, Cynthia, very much. We'll circle back to some of your comments after we hear from Jim. You're on mute, Jim.
That was the Russians interfering with my internet. Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. I really appreciate the way you've laid out, in a sense, the modern history of Putin in relation to the rest of the world, in a sense, but very specifically to the US. And I want to add a little bit to the earlier history as a part of understanding the man. And this goes back to sort of a book Hedrick Smith wrote, The Russians, in which he really laid out how the history of Russia has been several thousand years of being bordered by enemies, invaded dozens of times, and developed in the psyche of primarily the Soviet Russian elite as it currently still exists there. By that I mean older people. That is about figuring out how to make sure their borders are secure and they have some kind of domination over the countries that surround them on the borders. So there's a deep part of their psyche like this. Now I'm talking about an older generation because I think what I will comment on in relation to Cynthia's last thing is about the younger people, because that's changing the world. But I keep saying in the US, we got to stop electing 72-year-old guys because our generation hasn't yet understood that the future is completely unpredictable and the problems will not be solved by 20th century solutions. However, that's still the dominant point of view of the people who lead Russia, the United States, much of Europe. So think about Putin for a minute. Joined the KGB in 1975, okay? So for 45 years, he has held what he originally developed as his belief system within the intelligence community of the Soviet Union, okay? And his primary initial job was in the first directorate, which was responsible for monitoring foreigners. So he has a long history of learning about relating to non-Russians. Then in '84, he came to Moscow. He had been in Leningrad. He came to Moscow. They were going to send him to Germany, et cetera. And I only mention this because I have my own little, experience to report. I met him at a U.S. Embassy function in '85 because Jim and I and Cynthia and others were friends of the U.S. ambassador then, Arthur Hartman. And I didn't know it. I didn't know who he was. He was just one of the people who came. It was Hartman several years later who said, "Do you realize, Jim, that you met Putin at a reception I had?" Because he was, and it's important because he was a nondescript, middle of the road guy, immersed in the intelligence community, the KGB, rising in leadership. And it was actually Yeltsin who appointed him as his successor. And so he came to power on the heels of Yeltsin. And then, another little personal vignette, he did this very smart, he's a very good political guy. He did this very smart move. Constitution allowed him to be president twice, which he won significantly in the elections. And then he made sure that his prime minister was elected the next president, and he became prime minister so that after that guy went out of office, Putin could be elected again. And they changed the constitution in the meantime. So Putin has held power through political machinations for a long time. He's really good at this. I say this because my view is that you contrast that to a Donald Trump, who is not a politician. He has no history in foreign affairs, et cetera. And you put these two men together, and from my view, Trump doesn't have a chance. Putin really knows how to do whatever he needs to do with foreign leaders, especially Donald Trump, for the good of Russia, because ultimately it's about what's best for the mother country, and the agendas that are hidden behind the scenes in ways that none of us know about are significant, but they all go back to what's best for Mother Russia. Now, the last thing I'll say in this regard is that is in relation to what the old people think is in the best interest of Mother Russia. But what's happened in the last 20 years, as we all know, is first the internet, which has changed information all over the world. But secondly, what it's done is give power to a rising younger generation. And when you go to what's happening today in Russia, it's mainly young people in the streets. It's not a bunch of old Soviet, ex-Soviet Russians who, Cynthia, you may remember that when we were there, Stalin was one of the most popular figures in history for the older Soviets in Georgia, because as they said, with Stalin, we had control of crime and power, and we knew we were okay. But in the US and other parts of the world, and in Russia and China, younger generations are now moving into a position where they see they can actually wield power through a cumulative, in a sense, internet-based and inspired action, let's say. And we don't know what's going to happen, but I think where Putin is misjudging the rest of the world is the impact global world opinion has on what he's doing to the young people in the streets. And the US has made the same mistake in the past, but this is not going away. And it's changing the face of Russia. And as you said, Cynthia, what's coming next? To me, it's about the young people rising into positions of influence and really taking a different way of being in the world for the 21st century. And Putin doesn't understand this, nor do any of his people. And he's at risk for that. So I have to, Jim, I have to take like a 10-minute break, but I'll be right back.
Okay. Well, maybe what I can do is offer a perspective of my own, and then we can continue the dialogue. I think, in my view, the best way to understand Vladimir Putin is historically using the framework of the French Revolution. And just to refresh our memory of the French Revolution, that was a time when around 1789, you'll remember when it broke out and the storming of the Bastille on July 14th in Paris. The ancient regime of the king was overthrown by a group of moderates. And the moderates tried to hold an uneasy equilibrium. And that then broke down. And you had the third phase of the revolution, which was the reign of virtue and terror, when Robespierre and the Jacobins brought out the guillotine and just began to systematically execute and destroy the monarchy and moderation. And the King Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette were led to the guillotine and executed. And there were thousands of people across France in the ensuing months and a couple of years that were executed as the regime went into this reign of virtue and terror. Those were words coined by Robespierre himself, who in the end also was executed by the guillotine. And then came what they call the Thermidorian phase, named after the month of Thermidor, because in their revolutionary zeal, they had changed the names of all the months and so forth. And that was when a conservative reaction began to take place that corresponded with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte was an example of an authoritarian leader who consolidated the gains of the revolution, but within the context of an established order that in some ways returned to the time before the revolution. So those four phases of the ancient regime, a moderate phase, the reign of virtue and terror, and then the Thermidorian reaction is the classic model of revolution that has been replicated in other ways in other countries, but that's the classic model. In my view, the Russians went through that same process, and it was what Cynthia and Jim and I and many others were very privileged to observe and, in fact, to participate in. You had in the from 1917 to the early 1980s, the establishment of a totalitarian regime that was as coercive as any that's ever been constructed in the history of the world. It's estimated that Hitler, in his brief reign of 12 years, was responsible for the deaths of 17 million people, external to the carnage of the Second World War. Stalin is estimated was responsible for the deaths of between 20 to 30 million people. Mao Zedong, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski and others, was responsible in that revolution in China of upwards of 60 to 70 million people. So the consolidation of power in the Soviet Union in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s was horrific, but it put in place a regime that by the 1980s had become so corrupted and so discredited that what emerged in March of 1985 was Mikhail Gorbachev, a moderate who felt that he could reform the party, who enunciated two policies, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, and began a process of reform. But the reform always collapses because it is not able to meet the aspirational desires that have been built up to a breaking point under the old regime. There's too much pressure. And so that moderate phase always give way to the reign of virtue and terror. And in the Russian experience, that was Boris Yeltsin. And I happen to have had the great privilege of being actually with Yeltsin as he went through his experience of understanding that the moderate attempts by Gorbachev were insufficient. And it actually happened in a supermarket outside of Houston, Texas, as we were driving to the airport in September of 1989. Yeltsin wanted to see a supermarket. And so we stopped along the side of the road. It was just an ordinary Texas supermarket, not very distinguished in my view. But for Boris Yeltsin, seeing for the first time all the food and products that were available to the average American, it sent him into a psychic spasm, which we all witnessed. And he kept saying over again, they lied to us. They lied to us. And he vowed to destroy Gorbachev and destroy communism and bring in a new order. I watched it up close and personal. I met him again in Moscow several times, and we were involved in many, many ways as the reign of virtue and terror broke up the Soviet Union, overthrew Gorbachev in December 24th, 1991, and brought in a radical reformation of the now Russian Confederation Russian Federation and the other republics in a free market capitalist economy and makeover that was brought in through what they called, Jeffrey Sachs called, shock capitalism. And the structures, again, Cynthia and Jim and I were there. The structures broke down. There was massive poverty, there was violence, there was corruption, there was mafia groups. And out of that emerged Putin, appointed by Yeltsin. Yeltsin had appointed several prime ministers and presidents to try to stabilize, because he was in advanced stages of alcoholism and just basically was unable to govern. And it was, I think, on his third attempt, he turned to Vladimir Putin. And Putin very skillfully and very carefully began to consolidate power in the ancient Tsarist and Stalinist tradition. And there's a very famous story of Putin going out to the dacha that Stalin actually used and lived in, and inviting the oligarchs and sitting in the same chair as Stalin. Putin basically said to them, we have to restore order. You keep control of your domains of wealth, but I rule. And we can develop a symbiotic relationship in this new capitalist structure, but governed in an authoritarian way through essentially oligarchic fiefdoms. But I sit in the chair. And that regime has withstood the vicissitudes of fate for some time. And he still rules Russia today with an authoritarian capacity that rivals the czars and rivals the rule of Joseph Stalin. But it's not a communist system. It's now a basic capitalist system, an oligarchic system. So that's the function of the Thermidorian phase. To add a couple of historical points to what Cynthia said, after Putin seized power, his overtures to the West were very benign. He asked if Russia could join the NATO alliance. He said the Soviet Union is no more. We now have the same system you've got. Why doesn't Russia join the NATO alliance? He also offered for Russia to join the European Union. And the United States and NATO and the EU said no. They refused because they were still so caught up in Russia as enemy. They would not take the opportunity that the Russians, and specifically Putin, asked for. And that was a complete rapprochement. Just imagine if they'd have said yes, and the NATO alliance now included Russia, the European Union now included Russia, there'd be no conflict over the Ukraine. There'd been very little tensions, I would imagine, in the Middle East. But it was the United States, believing that in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that it was America's moment for absolute global supremacy. And in that posture, brought into this country, in the United States, by the neoconservative, like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and various other people, Donald Rumsfeld, that this was the moment for the United States to set its imperial stamp and control over planet Earth. And so Putin tried for a number of years. And then it was in 2007 at a meeting of the G20 that he made a very famous speech where he said, okay, if you guys are not going to do this in a collegial way, Russia will not be conquered. Russia will not be bullied. We may have a small economy. And by the way, it's just worth noting that the economy of Russia today is no bigger than the size of Italy's. Economically, Russia has probably more resources than any other nation on earth, but they've been unable to exceed an economic capacity of a small country like Italy. So the power of Russia is in its size and, as Cynthia pointed out, in its nuclear weapons. And so when the NATO alliance, rather than encompassing Russia, began to move east right along the Russian borders, that is when Putin and the Russians said, no, we're not going to let that happen. And if you look at the speech that Vladimir Posner gave at Yale, I put the link in the chat box. Please look at it. He says it would be just like if Mexico had a change of regime and invited the Russians to move weapons and so forth into Mexico. What would the United States do? Remember what the United States did when Cuba, back in the 1960s, welcomed Russian missiles. We almost went to nuclear war. But when we pushed our presence and our military and our politics into the Ukraine, which borders Russia, we were shocked and surprised that the Russians fought back and seized Crimea when it was a completely predictable response to a provocation, which, as Cynthia said, was a violation of the promises that the Bush Senior administration made to Mikhail Gorbachev as part of the arrangement of the Soviets letting the Eastern Europeans go free of Soviet hegemony in the late 1980s and early 1990s. There was an explicit agreement that there would be no encroachment of NATO or the EU to the east. And those promises were not kept. Russia was excluded. And so when we view Vladimir Putin, we have to view it within those contexts to understand some of the actions that he's taking over the last several years to destabilize NATO, to destabilize the international institutional regime, the EU, etc. This was not his original intent. It was a reaction to Western policies, as I've described. So that is just a viewpoint that I've developed over the years of going back and forth to the Soviet Union and studying Russian history. It's worth remembering Churchill's famous line that Russia is a mystery within an enigma wrapped in a riddle. They're very, very challenging for the Western mind to understand in any kind of rational or complete way. So anyway, those would be some comments. I'll ask Cynthia, you and Jim to share further viewpoints that you may have on this issue of understanding Russia and Vladimir Putin, and also the citizen diplomacy and the the renewal that you would envision as Russia and the West moves forward into the 2020s?
I would like to, Jim, that was took us very deep into really important issues in terms of understanding, putting a context and understanding how a piece of how we got to where we are today, from the promise of the end of the Cold War, where it seemed like everything was possible. And I want to respond to some comments that Jim made, and then also to some comments that you made. And I see some questions in the chat. So I want to see if I can address some of these things efficiently. Jim Hickman, you raised, I think, an important point I want to go a little bit deeper on, which is that the young people today have no living memory of really the fear and the terror of what the people that we knew and people like Vladimir grew up with, and others in the Soviet Union at that time, where, you know, when we were going there, contacts with foreigners, this was in the 1980s, it was still a risk for people to meet unofficially with us. And people were taking risks to do that. Most of the people that I know who are in our generation had people in their families that went missing in the middle of the night. There was a knock on the door and they were taken away by Stalin to the Gulag and never seen again. You know, one of my best friends was 5 years old when they knocked on the door. Her father was a Bolshevik leader, and they came to the door and her mother was saying, take this suitcase. He said, no, I'm coming home. I'm coming home. I'm coming home. I'll be back. No, you're not. Please take it. Please take it. And this was the last time my friend ever saw her father, because she got a letter after Stalin was rehabilitated in the 50s saying, as many Russians did, millions of Russians did, saying, we're sorry to inform you that, you know, your father is no longer alive and he perished in this camp in such and such a place at such and such a time. So that is, the young people today are of a different mix, and the leadership in Russia was formed by this time of growing up under the Soviet system that made these people. They're still connected to that system. Vladimir Putin, Jim, you raised, you know, rose in the ranks of the KGB within that very repressive authoritarian Soviet system. That's still in their cellular memory. Whatever we're doing today, that's still part of it. The younger generation doesn't have that life experience of that time. So they don't have the fear that was just really palpable pretty much everywhere when we were going there. When you were inside someone's home, you could let it go and you could be together. So I think that's a very important part of what's coming in Russia, and what we're seeing emerge in Russia is this new generation that didn't grow up with that mindset that was so omnipresent everywhere. I just want to come back to Jim Garrison. I want to be this idea that Putin proposed of Russia coming into NATO and joining and having a collective security agreement, that we could all focus on common enemies. That was originally Gorbachev's vision and proposed at the UN. And that was one of the reasons that he also, in really the most bloodless revolution, allowed Eastern Europe, and starting with Germany and letting the Berlin Wall come down, letting freedom just, and it was this beautiful vision. And at that time, for us, having the privilege of being witnesses to history up close and personal, everything seemed possible. This all seemed like we could take this forward. And there is one question in the chat. Did you say that the US didn't win the Cold War, Russia just opted out of it? I didn't understand that. Can you say more to explain this? This idea that because the Cold War ended the way it did, and we say the Soviet Union collapsed, they don't say it collapsed. They agreed to break up. There was an agreement that took place after Yeltsin, with Yeltsin and Belarus and Ukraine, that we were going to end the Soviet Union. That would enable Yeltsin to have power, because at that point he was the president of Russia, and then Gorbachev, he could then take over. So they don't see that they collapsed. They don't see that they lost the Cold War. They see it as it was a joint agreement. Reagan and Gorbachev came together and changed history, decided to work together to try to eliminate nuclear weapons. We had the INF Treaty. We had all of these things that were possible. And so they see it as we jointly ended the Cold War. And in reality, we all won the Cold War because we didn't blow each other up. That's the victory. It was a shared victory. So that's the answer to that question. And I want to just circle back again to imagine that you're in a country that has a history of foreign invasion that has decimated your population over centuries. This happened with the Mongol invasion in the Middle Ages in Russia. Then it happened with Napoleon. Then it happened with Hitler and Germany. And I will go back to say again, 27 million Soviets gave their lives during that war, lost their lives, so that the World War II could come to an end. And so that memory of war, that memory of invasion, that memory of protecting their borders from further invasion is what is underneath this desire to, and this commitment that was made, that was so important to them by the West, that NATO never expand east because they don't want to be invaded again. We have no experience of that in our country that's comparable in our history in the United States. We had the Civil War within our own country. We had 9/11. We had, we had the Revolutionary War, but we haven't had anything of that magnitude. So that's still present in the Russian experience. And that's something that they will defend their country, any infringement, because they have this cellular memory of war. And, Vladimir said in an interview I did with him a few years ago, I don't think the memory of war will ever go away in this country. And it's intergenerational trauma. So I think that when we did the work that we did in the 1980s, we were able to take it to a certain place, and not just the citizen diplomats, but the governments as well. But the sort of history of the trauma, the collective trauma that happened in our countries during the Cold War, that trauma was never completely healed. And the trauma now of, Jim, you brought up the shock therapy that the US came into Russia with under Yeltsin. The Russians also felt betrayed about that because it impoverished them. That policy that we brought in, our way of capitalism at all cost, it was a Wild West free-for-all and rape of the country and the natural resource of the country, and seizing wealth by the oligarchs. Russians felt very betrayed that the West had actually played a role in creating the greatest depression really in history, other than our Great Depression. It was greater than that Great Depression in the 20th century. So there was that, there was the expansion of NATO, there's all of that. That's the container that we're working with. that has created this. How do we get seen? How do we get taken seriously? Well, we interfere in your elections. Pay attention to us. So we've been calling them, Obama called Russia at one point, a third rate or a second rate country, not to, you don't talk to a country like that has as many nuclear weapons as Russia does. I don't think without it was very offensive. It was humiliating. So where do we go from here? I come back to what Jim said in the last meeting, listen to our inner guidance. What is wanting to happen here? And I think that we have the chance, we have to think about what is the moonshot moment for our time. We had the vision of the Apollo-Soyuz link up that showed cooperation in space. That was something that elevated everybody's thoughts and ideas about our capacity to cooperate with Russia. We had the end of the Cold War. We had the coming down of the Berlin Wall. We had, I worked on a project. We had the space bridges that we've talked about. I brought Soviet and American young people climbing to the top of the mountain together as a demonstration of our ability to cooperate, and making a film about it and having it broadcast on the eve of the summit to show what are those demonstrations, what can take us out of this locked place that we're in for the greater good. And so our colleague William Ury talks about a moonshot for climate, for the planet, in which we would have kind of an Olympics to plant those trillion trees that scientists say would be game-changing for our climate. We could reduce 25% of CO2 if we plant 1 trillion trees. I have a Russian colleague in the disarmament, non-proliferation world, arms control, Vladimir Orlov, and he says, we just need one success story. We need to start somewhere and create one success story. And so we can dream together, and it's the young people, it's all of you young people with us today and out there that we invite your dreaming. We need you. You're carrying this forward. So that's my prayer, is that we create that. Imagine if we plant those trillion trees, and we have imagine, this might sound naive or impossible, but imagine we have North Korean and South Korean young people doing this together in the DMZ where there's a forest. Imagine that we have this happening together in Siberia, where the forest has been on fire, and in Alaska, where the forest, but we do it jointly. Imagine. I'm working on a project now where we're going to bring young people and indigenous young people and elders together in the Bering Strait in small boats. We're going to plant trees on both sides of the Bering Strait. We have to think together about, maybe it's a mission to Mars. We talked about that in the 1980s. That should be international. So collaborating on vaccines for the good, sharing knowledge. We have these existential threats that are begging for cooperation. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cynthia. Jim, what's your view? You're on mute.
You're muted, Jim.
My view has expanded dramatically listening to Cynthia. I've learned a lot. Thank you, Cynthia. I want to just make one primary comment. You mentioned Reagan and Gorbachev. Some of you probably know that Jim Garrison and Gorbachev created a collaborative venture together, the Gorbachev Foundation. And with my participation, we toured Gorbachev in the US, the first time he'd been here since he had left office. And when we arrived in California, we were met by Reagan. And in fact, later he went to Reagan's Ranch, et cetera. And I remember sitting at dinner with Reagan and Gorbachev. My role was always, I stood behind Gorbachev and protected him from all of the gawking people who wanted to touch him. But standing there watching Reagan and Gorbachev, I was struck by, in a sense, how what Cynthia was referring to, history wanted to happen, and it required those two men to have a kind of commitment within themselves and then the capacity to join together to make such a huge difference. And as Cynthia pointed out, bring the Cold War to a close. So I think it's important that we also recognize the role of certain leaders, and I would bring it back to the present. In the situation with Navalny, it's really kind of extraordinary that Navalny, one, survived a poisoning, probably by the Putin regime, and two, that single man, in a sense, dissident, somewhat of a political rival to Putin, but nothing really extraordinary, has radicalized and brought to the streets millions of people around Russia. That one man, and it's sort of indicative of what, going back to what Cynthia was saying, the fear that underlies the leaders, because it's an unknown. And what Navalny represents is an unbelievable fear in them that the whole Russian people begin to come behind him and oppose Putin. Again, one man has made this happen and drawn all of our interest and perhaps motivated many of the leaders and governments of the world to try to discipline Putin in a certain way for what he's doing to the people in the streets. So it's sort of indicative of a significant shift that seems to be happening, that, in Cynthia's words, wants to happen. And millions of people are embracing it, like hundreds of thousands of us did in the 80s, as Cynthia points out. Something wanted to happen, and we were called to do something about it. Not individuals, but large groups of people, Cynthia with young people going to the top of the mountain, and many, many others we can identify as what, the press called citizen diplomats. And now it's similar. Something is wanting to happen, and it's bringing millions of people around the world to focus on events that look like the old world. What Putin is doing now is the same thing, as Cynthia points out, they've been doing for several hundred years, if not 1,000 years, and it's out of date. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work anymore. And we have to participate. More and more people coming together to express a different way. And of course, probably the most important change in history that has allowed all this to occur is the internet. Nobody had any idea that the internet would become the primary means of communication for radicals all over the world. And China has just closed down one of the apps that appeared recently, where a lot of people were having freedom of speech, and China has gotten a little scared about what's going on. But that can't be stopped. So Cynthia, I really appreciate the way you've laid out the history and the perspective of what's going on. And I think in the Humanity Rising initiative, we have the people, in a sense, the thousands, dozens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are expressing the need, desire, want to make a different world emerge in the 21st century. And that's what it takes. So I think a part of what wants to happen is a new kind of civilization. And initiatives like HR and what, Cynthia, you're doing with women and nuclear weapons and et cetera around the world are examples of how it's starting to happen. And we need to support it and initiate more in that direction. And you know, we can look at history of how the United States might have shaped Putin, but in my opinion, that's old news. We're now moving into a new world. And, you know, it's like what we used to say about the Chinese when we were doing a couple of citizen diplomat things in China. And it was all about wait until the Politburo in the Chinese and in the Soviet Union, wait until they all die off. And then a new generation will emerge. And we're at that point now. So get ready to really act dramatically in the coming years to change the way the world is designed and become a more collaborative and cooperative venture, because there are millions of people in Russia who want to join in that initiative, that's for sure.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you both. As we draw our session now to a close, we're still trying to track Vladimir Posner. We're not sure what happened, but he's brilliant on this whole subject. And so we'll schedule him down the trail so that you can hear from him directly. And in the meantime, if you would take the time to look at the speech he gave in 2017 at Yale. It's very, very thoughtful and also thought-provoking on these matters. So I would close by making two comments. One, that it's always good to take opportunities such as these to challenge what we think we already know to be true. And as you know, we try to do that as often as we can through Humanity Rising, because this is a very precious moment, everyone. The pandemic has stopped our world and allowing the whole world to be in the same conversation in a way that has the potential to change our definition of ourselves, our relationship with the larger ecosystem, and thereby shape the future in a way that would be very constructive. And I think as I look back on the reign of Vladimir Putin and you know, the tenure of Mikhail Gorbachev, his 6 years between 1985 and 1991, you see one of the biggest missed opportunities in modern history. Gorbachev first, and then Putin literally begged the West to let Russia join the community of nations. And they were refused. Why? Because the West was so locked into an old mindset, it couldn't see the obvious. And I'd be willing to predict, had Russia joined NATO and the European Union, we would have probably done a lot more to solve the nuclear problem. We would have solved many of the geostrategic issues that continue to plague us. So and this leads to the second point, you know, just to underscore what Jim and Cynthia both said, And I just wanted to refer to something Marilyn Hamilton put in the chat. That the Russians did a parallel Humanity Rising summit in the summer of 2020 that attracted 17,000 Russians, both in Russia and the diaspora, 430 cities, 40 plus countries, meaning, that the Russians do want to change, and how we can support them through collaboration, mediation, etc., is really the challenge of our time. And so the final comment that I would make, in the absence of our governments doing the obvious, it's up to us citizens as citizen diplomats to do what must be done, like Marilyn Hamilton through Integral Cities Meshworks, what Cynthia Lazaroff is doing through her nuclear initiatives, what many of you out there are doing to bring the world together in creative and new ways. The governments seem on most matters to be essentially brain dead. And Vladimir Putin has suffered, and the Russians and the West and the world commensurately. And as we go into this extraordinarily critical moment in history, we're working here at Ubiquity. And I know all of you are 24/7, 365, to put new ideas out there, to establish collaborative partnerships, to welcome diversity, to embolden the solutions that have been sitting around for decades in many instances, that it could solve these problems, like planting 1 trillion trees. I mean, how obvious is that? How obvious is that? And is there a country anywhere that's actually doing it in a serious way? No. It's coming out of the NGO community. It's coming out of the corporations in many cases. So that's the nexus point, everyone, in my view. And I think Cynthia's and Jim's. It's with the young. It's with Humanity Rising. It's with the choices that we make day in and day out about who we are and how we want to relate to others and the kind of world that we want to build. So thank you for joining. And Cynthia and Jim, thank you for waxing eloquent in the absence of Vladimir, who we'll have him back. He's worth the wait. And then tomorrow, we're going to shift to the issue of radical brilliance, because that's what we all need to learn. How do we take what we're all doing, infuse it with more brilliance in a radically collaborative way? That's going to be the subject for tomorrow's dialogue with Arjuna Arma and Peter Mary. Radical brilliance. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you here tomorrow. And those of you who want to join the after session chat, Cynthia, Jim, you're welcome to join us. The link is in the chat box. And we'll see you then again tomorrow, everyone. Same time, same station, 5:00 p.m. Central European Time here on Zoom for Humanity Rising. Bye-bye. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.